It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event today, both in person and several people also joining us remotely over Zoom. To this event at the University of Michigan on Jewish and Christian women in the ancient Mediterranean world. In just a few short minutes, I will introduce our esteemed guest and speaker, but before I do, I'd like to take a few brief moments to thank all those involved in sponsoring this event. To the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies for its co-sponsorship, for the Department of Middle East Studies and the Frankel Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, thank you for your financial and logistical support. To Wendy Sutton, who's worked tirelessly to coordinate the logistics of the event, to Dr. Joshua Scott, who's offering remote technological assistance, to Professor Gabriele Bocconcini, who advertised the event in the community among his students, to Professor Rave Neese, the new director of Michigan's Interdepartmental Program of Ancient History, for advertising the event as well. Thank you everyone for your support. Without this event would not have been possible. Our event this evening has two main parts. The first part will be an academic talk delivered by Dr. Sheinfeld, who I'll introduce in a few short minutes. And the second half will be a Q&A with three authors of a textbook that's recently been published, including Dr. Sheinfeld, Dr. Parks, and Dr. Warren. Before introducing our speaker, let me first introduce John Brent from the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies to describe the center and what it does to promote the academic study of Christianity at the University of Michigan and the community.
Thank you for the applause. I didn't expect that. Thank you for indulging me. I need to say a few things about the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies. It's referred to as either the Center or MCECS. The chief passion of the Michigan Center or MCECS is promotion of the visibility of early Christianity and Christian antiquity to give all of us a closer understanding of who we are as a people today. The center tries to do this through a number of means, but in particular, chief among which are public events and lectures like this one today, and that we continue to develop and sponsor and support these events as they point us to the importance of events of peoples living 2 millennia ago that influence in very important ways our culture today. We also promote awareness of early Christianity through supporting graduate studies and students, both undergrad and graduate, through donations, through scholarships and so forth. And this is done here at the University of Michigan and elsewhere, other institutions of higher learning. Generally, and very importantly, the Michigan Center attempts to promote biblical literacy. This is biblical literacy in a culture that is quickly losing its collective knowledge of the Old and New Testaments and cognate works. Our center also supports the Enoch Seminar. It's an international network of scholars devoted to the study of Second Temple Judaism and Christian, rabbinic, and Islamic origins. You can check out the Enoch Center, Enoch Seminar on its website, enochseminar.org. And you can find out much more about the Michigan Center at our website, mcecs.org. And as a 501c3 organization, you can donate toward our mission tax-free. And we'd be glad also to talk to anyone interested in doing other types of work other than donating funds. Thank you for giving me your attention. But thanks especially for your participation in this presentation. And with that, I hand off to Dr. Forger.
At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shayna Sheinfeld. Dr. Sheinfeld is an assistant professor of religion at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. Her research focuses on how Jews and Christians in antiquity constructed leadership and community with an eye toward gender and other marginalized identities. She's the author of numerous articles and chapters. She's edited the book Gender in Second Temple Period Judaism with Dr. Kathy Ahrensberger, and she has another forthcoming volume with her as well. She's also the co-author, along with Dr. Parks and Dr. Warren, of the recently published textbook Jewish and Christian Women in the Ancient Mediterranean, which we'll discuss later today. Dr. Sheinfeld's talk today is entitled Resistance, Resilience, and Remembrance, Flipping the Script About Jewish and Christian Women in Antiquity. Thank you for coming today.
So I just wanted to first offer my voice in the thank yous for all the various people and organizations that have brought me here today. I had the pleasure of being here last year as a research fellow at the Frankel Institute for Judaic Studies. And so it was really exciting to arrive today and have all 4 seasons available to me in one short trip. Pretty amazing that we had snow. It's beautiful out now. I especially want to thank Dr. Deborah Forger for inviting me to give this talk and really kind of organizing everything. I also want to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Wyandot Nation. While I make this acknowledgement as a guest of the University of Michigan, I hope that my acknowledgement of the indigenous tribes whose lands I am now speaking on also reminds us that we must remain vigilant as we examine our own actions as participants, whether or not we intend to be, in colonialism and silencing. In the year 203, in the Roman city of Carthage, which is now in modern-day Tunisia, a young Roman noblewoman and recent mother named Vivia Perpetua was arrested on the charge of being a Christian. Together with several others, including an enslaved pregnant woman named Felicitas, Perpetua was imprisoned, tried, and eventually killed in the public games, which celebrated the birthday of the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus. Perpetua kept a diary during this time where she records her experiences leading up to her execution. After being imprisoned, she and her fellow catechumens are called before the magistrate, where each one of them is asked and refuses to offer sacrifices to the well-being of the emperor. When at last they come to Perpetua, her father appears with her infant son in order to make an appeal to her sense of familial duty. The procurator, not particularly eager to sentence a young noble mother to death, says, "Spare the gray hairs of your father, spare the infancy of your boy, offer sacrifice for the well-being of the emperor." Perpetua replies simply, "I will not." The procurator is then resigned to ask, "Are you a Christian?" Perpetua replies, "I am a Christian." Perpetua and the other Christians in prison with her are soon martyred in the amphitheater. Perpetua's story is such an engaging one because it is rare among ancient evidence. It tells of how a woman stood up against the social pressures. There's not a lot of room up here. Negotiate. All right. How a young woman stood up against the social pressures to conform to what a Roman daughter should be. It tells how she stood firm against the societal expectations of how a mother should act in order to hold fast to her faith. And it tells how she refused to back down even when confronted with the might of the Roman Empire. Even much more rare, much of it appears to be in her own voice. The Passion of Perpetua, the text which embeds these ostensibly authentic diaries, paints an enticing picture of brave and principled resistance to empire. But part of its appeal is in its gendered novelty. While the ancient Mediterranean world offers tales of plenty of men's resistance against empires, tyrants, seductresses, and beasts, Women in resistance narratives tend to be trotted out as bit players in the stories of men, or as a means of mocking and emasculating tyrants challenged by the hands of a woman. Rather than as active and agenic characters, or even historical individuals with their own religious visions and agendas, like Perpetua. The earliest feminist biblical scholars may have worked hard to draw attention to biblical and apocryphal women as forgotten role models of feminine bravery, but more often than not, ancient female characters are simply being used by male authors as mechanisms for expressing some view. Perpetua's story is somewhat unique in that many scholars believe her to have been a real person and deem her diaries to be authentically written by her. Hers is thus a relatively clear example of resistance both to patriarchal expectations of the compliant daughter and dutiful mother, and to imperial expectations of loyalty to the emperor and realm. In the Passion of Perpetua, we have a plausible window onto a mystical visionary who embraced death with relish as a martyr, who mentored and encouraged other young women and also men, who modeled stoic unconcern with physical hardship, and who defied social norms. But in most cases, strong women in ancient texts are thinking tools, signs male authors employ to point to something else. Even Perpetua's firsthand account is not considered historical by all scholars of early Christianity. Does this mean that we have little to no evidence for early Jewish and Christian women's resistance, and we must abandon the notion of ever uncovering it? Or what if, instead of reading resistance only in very obvious cases where the texts suggest we should, we dig a little deeper to consider all the little clues for less obvious occurrences of gendered resistance? Perpetua's resistance to Rome is a rare specimen in that it is so clear. However, women are constantly resisting in much smaller ways in our ancient evidence. It is just not always where we have been trained to look for it. By flipping the script in our search for women as resistors, I employ an intersectional feminist hermeneutic. I start with the premise that the main narrative, that is, what is usually the male author's male-centered narrative, is not the only story that is being told. I center the undercurrents, the voices and experience of women, over and against the primary narrative being presented. Indeed, pushing back against dominant scholarly narratives that presents men's concerns and actions as normative is in itself an act of resistance. Let's take a look at 4 examples: the Maccabean mother in 2nd Maccabees, the Masada narrative, Queen Berenike, and the apocalypse of 4th Ezra. Through these examples, I hope to show how centering women's narratives in ancient sources highlight the various and diverse ways that women embody resistance. According to the apocryphal text known as 2nd Maccabees, there was an attempted genocide of the Jewish people by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid emperor in the 2nd century BCE. The text relates that there was widespread killing of all Jews that would not renounce Torah observance. Sure. Give us just a moment. I'm leaving you hanging. You don't know what happens now. Does anybody know what happens in 2nd Maccabees? Has anybody read the text? Can I have a show of hands? All right. My 3 favorite, no, I'm just kidding. Great, I'm so excited I get to introduce you to this text in a minute. It's okay. All right. Is that better?
Is that better for everybody in the room?
Volume's better for everybody? Sorry? This is not the mic that I'm using. This is the mic that I'm using. I don't know what we're, I don't.
That's all.
Oh, I'm trying to speak into the microphone.
Right.
Yes, maybe, yes.
Test 1, 2.
Just 1, 2. Okay. Is it bad on the Zoom now? It still sounds good on the Zoom?
Sounds good on the Zoom.
Sounds fine.
It's so, I think the issue is that in order to get it to sound good on the Zoom, we had to turn it down so far that it doesn't, that we can't hear in the room anymore.
You're gonna hear my gurgling throat or something instead of my voice. I don't know if that's gonna work. How's that? I can also speak up. If I had known that was it, I could have just spoken up, but all right, so we're okay. All right, so we're looking at 4 examples. I'm getting my place too, but also hopefully helping you remember what we're talking about. So I was talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid emperor who was killing Jews who wanted to continue to observe Torah. Right? Everybody's with me here. We're in the 2nd century. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Okay, all right. Among the resistors that this text showcases is a Jewish widow captured along with her 7 sons and forcibly ordered to eat pork in front of Antiochus himself. The family refuses, and in turn, each son is tortured despite their obvious agony and the increasingly depraved tactics used in their deaths. Each successive son refuses Antiochus's command to break God's laws. Through all of this, the mother is forced to stand by and watch as each of her sons, all 7 of them, undergo a painful death. Before the youngest of the 7 is killed, Antiochus entreats her to convince her last child that he will be rewarded with riches and power if only he gave in and ate a small bite of pork, clearly thinking that after watching her 6 other sons be murdered, she would cave in to prevent the death of the last. What do you think happens? Instead of doing that, she speaks to him in Hebrew, which the king cannot understand, and counsels him to stand strong, reminding him that resurrection awaits the righteous. She says, "My son, have pity on me. I carried you 9 months in my womb and nursed you for 3 years and have reared you and brought you up to this point in your life and have taken care of you. I beg you, my child, to look at the heaven and the earth and see that see everything that is in them and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed. And in the same way, the human race came into being. Do not fear this butcher, but prove worthy of your brothers. Accept death, so that in God's mercy, I may get you back along with your brothers." Defiant until the end, her youngest son is killed. Then the text succinctly states, last of all, the mother died after her sons. Various features in this narrative suggest that it is a highly stylized literary creation rather than a report of a real historical event. While it is likely that many Jews did face brutal death under Antiochus IV, it is unlikely that he would have allowed a public execution such as this one to take place, where each victim is given ample rein to mock the king at length before being tortured and killed. The strength of the mother's conviction in the face of her son's murders, combined with the king's rage, highlight that this is a woman who is used to think with. That is, this mother is being deployed in the text as a way for the author to point to something else. In this case, the unmanly and pathetic character of Antiochus IV and the indebtedness of his eventual downfall to the Jews' commitment to Torah observance. But while these martyrdoms may have been a literary creation to support the author's aims, the use of a woman in a story such as this does so much more than serve the author. In this story, the mother is remembered as having the agency to resist even in the face of extreme torture. Because of course, watching one's loved ones tortured and killed one by one is indeed torture. Like Perpetua, this character is overwhelmingly defined in the text by her womanhood and her role as a mother. Like Perpetua, breastfeeding is an important trope of her characterization, here emphasizing her close connection to her children, whereas in Perpetua's case, turning away from breastfeeding was used to signal her disconnection from the earthly realm. The Maccabean mother is brave, articulate, and knowledgeable about Torah and Jewish ideas of resurrection, encouraging her sons to face death in this world so they will be rewarded with life in the world to come. She endures all this while confidently mocking a powerful emperor. She dies with honor for her God and for her convictions. Whether or not she is a real person, whether or not this story depicts actual events, the Maccabean mother has been remembered. The early rabbis named her Miriam bat Tanchuma, and she is known in many Christian traditions as Hannah. She's given a name in both. She is remembered as a powerful role model for ancient Jews, Christians, and contemporary readers alike. And each time she is memorialized, each time she persists in our cultural memory, each time constitutes another example of resistance. We now turn to another narrative of tragic death in the face of an oppressive regime. But in this narrative, the women are pushed to the margins. We turn to Masada as recounted by the first century Jewish historian Josephus. Toward the end of the Jewish war against Rome, after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, the Romans went about destroying any remaining pockets of resistance. One such group, known as the Sicarii, had earlier in the war captured a desert fortification located above the Dead Sea, known as Masada. You can see it on the screen. That's what it looks like today, not what it looked like in the first century. They moved there along with their families and any others who supported their anti-Roman cause. In 73 CE, the Romans laid siege to Masada, building fortified camps and a siege ramp on the western side of the plateau. And that's what the siege ramp looks like. Again, today, probably not the same in the first century. As they prepared to attack the trapped Jews, the leader of the Sicarii, Eleazar ben Yair, attempted to convince his male compatriots that rather than allowing themselves and their wives and their children to be killed or enslaved by the Romans, it would be better that everyone die with dignity by their own hand. This speech was convincing to the men, driven to desperation by the siege and thoughts of starvation or torture and enslavement. So they agreed to draw lots and kill the women and children before killing one another, with the last one standing committing suicide. The men apparently undertook the action almost immediately. When the Romans reached the top of Masada, they found the flaming ruins of the Sicarii supplies and not a soul alive. Josephus reports that they were amazed at the Sicarii's nobility and resolve. For many interpreters, Eleazar ben Yair, the leader of this last-ditch defiance against Rome, is a pious hero who was able to resist Rome, if not in military might, then through unwavering commitment to Judaism. He took seriously the Sicarii motto, "No ruler but God." And when the capture of Masada was inevitable, he turned to his men to convince them that being enslaved by the Romans would constitute serving another besides God, and thus betraying the Sicarii pledge. Other interpreters find his solution of murdering wives, children, and finally one another ethically problematic, and note that neither murder nor suicide are condoned in the Torah. Regardless of whether Eliezer is read as a model of piety and dedication to God, or as an extremist reckless with the lives of his fellow Jews, his speech and actions represent resistance against Roman rule, regardless of the cost. The overwhelming interpretive focus on Eliezer and the extreme outcome obscures some other resistance figures in the story. When the Romans reached the top of Masada and found only flames, Josephus reports that they called out to see if anyone was still alive. According to the report, 7 people had survived the massacre, 2 women and 5 children. These 2 women had taken these 5 children and hidden in the aqueducts below. Of these 2 women, one is described as old, and the other, a relative of Eleazar, is described as superior in wisdom and training to other women. It is the second of these 2 women who describes in detail to the Romans what happened on Masada, including what Eleazar had said and how the murder-suicide pact was carried out. Like the Maccabean martyr, these women remain unnamed. Josephus uses them as the means by which what happened at Masada is relayed to the Romans. His construction of gender here is super careful. One woman he describes as elderly and therefore supposedly beyond that lustful age. The other younger woman is said to be wise and to have better training than most women. There are reasons for these descriptions. For example, just what training the wise woman had is unclear, but is likely meant to be the reason as to why the Romans can trust her and her report on what Eleazar said and on what happened. Both women are in charge of the 5 children, placing these women in the normative gender role as caregiver, which suggests that they have no suspicious or ulterior motives beyond staying alive and keeping children alive, and therefore they can be believed. But I would like to propose a different or maybe an additional reading which centers the stories of these 2 women. Let's take a moment to employ a hermeneutic of imagination. Scholars like Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, Will Gaffney, Bernadette Bruton, Meredith Warren, James McGrath, and Adele Reinhardt have all in different ways shown that when evidence is sorely lacking, as it is often the case for ancient women, then imagination is part of the required interpretive strategy. Of course, all ancient history is a creative and subjective enterprise, but an intentional hermeneutic of imagination is particularly illustrative where evidence is sparse, and particularly important with regards to marginalized people in the historical record. Warren observes that mainstream scholarship currently tolerates quite a lot of imagination when it comes to mainstream ideas of what counts as likely job, family type, family life, type of residence, etc., but not when it comes to imagining the active, engaged presence of women or other marginalized groups. Under siege, with dwindling resources and the threat of death, torture, sexual violence, or enslavement for them all and their loved ones, these women must have found themselves scared, as I suspect any of us would be in a similar circumstance. So let's imagine these women overhearing Eleazar's plan. Let's imagine them discussing it and coming up with their own plan. Together, they decide that a different form of resistance must happen. Resistance not only against the Romans, but also against Eleazar's murder-suicide pact. They somehow manage to gather 5 children, perhaps relatives of theirs, or orphans from the war, perhaps needing to make the difficult decision to leave behind babies who can't be kept quiet and would make too much noise, or perhaps scooping up whichever little ones are nearest in a hurry, or attempting to save as many children as they can without raising the alarm. Let's imagine them hiding before Eleazar has even finished his speech. In this case then, when the Sicarii are resisting ever having to bow to the Romans, these women are resisting the plans of their male kin. And while resistance often looks like combat or brazen declarations of faith in the face of death, like those of Eleazar or Perpetua or the Maccabean mother, in this case, resistance is quieter. It involves hiding, remaining silent, and surviving. These examples of resistance press us to think about the relationship between history and fiction in antiquity. Perpetua's diary, if it is authentic, is bookended by highly rhetorical narratives which reframe her experience as martyr. The Maccabean mother does not represent a single historical woman, but rather might be an amalgam of possible experiences during real oppression. And the women at Masada, while detailed by a historian, possibly had their roles and actions exaggerated to suit Josephus's aims. There is a slipperiness between fiction and history that ancient historians like Herodotus and Thucydides actively discuss. Berenike, an historical woman known from several sources, also has her story told by Josephus. Despite the way he couches it as historiography, we would do well to remember the soft boundary between fiction and history and keep watch for places where Josephus's rhetoric creates space for reading suspiciously or imaginatively about Berenike's own experiences. Born around 28 CE, Julia Berenike, also referred to as Berenike II, the Herodians were very famous for reusing names. So it's important to have those numbers after so you know who you're talking about. She was also Queen Berenike. She was the great granddaughter of Herod the Great. In her early teens, she was married to the nephew of Philo of Alexandria, another well-known first-century Jewish writer. After her first husband's death, she was married to her uncle, Herod King of Chalcis, which made her queen. He died when she was only 20, leaving her with their 2 sons. Berenike's brother, Agrippa II, was appointed king in place of his uncle, and the 2 siblings acted as co-regents, appearing together in official capacity. Berenike was married once again to Polemo, king of Cilicia, likely in part to squelch rumors of incestuous relations between her and her brother. When this marriage ended, Berenike returned to rule beside her brother. While Agrippa II and Berenike were both the active rulers at the time of the outbreak of the first Jewish revolt against Rome, my focus here will be on the queen and especially her act of resistance in an episode leading up to the outbreak of the Jewish revolt. Here is her story. I have to set the stage a little bit, so I'm not going to talk about her for just a minute so you can get an idea of what the context is. The Roman procurator in charge of Judea at that time was Gessius Florus, who was antagonistic toward the Jewish population. In this instance, Florus had encouraged a bribe from the Jewish population in Caesarea in order to keep certain non-Jewish locals from disturbing them when they were in prayer at the synagogue. Florus then left for the countryside, allowing those same locals to offer unkosher sacrifices in front of the synagogue, thereby rendering the building space unusable for the Jews. When members of the Jewish population reached out to discuss the matter with Florus, he had them imprisoned. So this incident led to unrest in Jerusalem. So when Florus then went to Jerusalem and took 17 talents of silver from the temple treasury, Josephus reports that the Jewish community organized peaceful protests, although there were a few members of that Jewish community who also decided to take out baskets and go around collecting alms for Florus as if he was poor, which enraged him and made matters much worse. He ordered his soldiers to destroy the upper market near the temple and to destroy anyone found within. Anyone captured was to be brought before him for scourging and crucifixion. Josephus likely exaggerates the number, but he reports that some 3,600 people were killed in this event. During these events, King Agrippa was away visiting a political ally in Alexandria in Egypt. However, Berenike was in Jerusalem making pilgrimage to the temple. Josephus writes, his sister Berenike, who was at Jerusalem, witnessed with the liveliest emotion the outrages of the soldiers and constantly sent her cavalry commanders and bodyguards to Florus to implore him to put a stop to the carnage. But he, regarding neither the number of the slain nor the exalted rank of his suppliant, but only the profit accruing from the plunder, turned a deaf ear to her prayers. The mad rage of the soldiers even vented itself upon the queen. Not only did they torture and put their captives to death under her eyes, but they would have also killed her had she not hastened to seek refuge in the palace, where she passed the night surrounded by guards, dreading an attack of troops. She was visiting Jerusalem to discharge a vow to God. For it is customary for those suffering from illness or other affliction to make a vow to abstain from wine and to shave their heads during the 30 days preceding that on which they must offer sacrifice. These rites Berenike was then undergoing, and she would come barefoot before the tribunal and make supplication to Florus without any respect being shown to her, and even at the peril of her own life. Berenike finds herself in Jerusalem completing a Nazirite vow. By taking this vow, Berenike has abased herself, cutting her hair, wearing simple clothes, and abstaining from wine in the period leading up to the sacrifices she is offering at the temple. And it is in the midst of her pilgrimage when these rites take place. While in the process of this ritual, Berenike appears before Florus, already humbled in appearance, to ask him to put a stop to the violence before she herself is chased down by Roman soldiers. She's only able to get away unharmed because of her guards. Her placement in Jerusalem as a Nazirite is not to be glossed over. While she is a Herodian and part of the elite class, which was appointed by and worked with Rome to rule in Judea, her presence in Jerusalem and her ritual actions highlight her self-identification as a Jew and her commitment to Judaism and the Jewish community. That she chooses to present herself before Florus while she's in the midst of a highly visible cultic act highlights her choice to stand alongside and protest with her fellow Jews, rather than to identify only as an elite who can opt out of being affected by the unrest, or wait for her brother, the king, to return to address the situation. Instead, Berenike does not only witness the events, but places herself in them, presenting herself before Florus and asking for the cessation of violence. After this incident, Berenike does not stop. She petitions Roman authorities to investigate the situation. She makes public appearances to help support the calls for a peaceful resolution and actively works to prevent outright revolt. It would be easy to overlook Berenike as a figure of resistance. Despite this narrative I focused on, the sources for Berenike are overwhelmingly portray her negatively. As with most Herodian women in Josephus, her portrayals are over-sexualized and her ambitions are seen as unwomanly. Scholars who fall for this slut-shaming rhetoric miss her significant role in resistance leadership. Her reputation is also overshadowed by rumors of incest and by her long love affair with the Roman general and future Flavian emperor of Rome, Titus. However, in many ways, her resistance is the most traditional kind. It's administrative. She uses her political power through diplomacy to step in with Rome, writes petitions, makes appearances as a figurehead when King Agrippa speaks, and uses her shared identity as a Jew to try to stop the rise in violence. Berenike's choice of tactics is available to her only because of her elite status. Other lower status women had to rely on other methods to enact resistance. Berenike's Jewishness allies her with lower status Jews resisting oppression, but her royal status removes her from the immediate risk of violence which they face. As our final example, I turn to one of the many apocalypses so popular in early Judaism and early Christianity, the apocalypse of 4th Ezra, written around 100 CE. This non-canonical book may be semi-canonical. It's in the Apocrypha, so you could find it there under 2nd Esdras. This book revisits the biblical figure of Ezra, who lived in the aftermath of the destruction of the first temple, as a way to think through the theological trauma of the destruction of the second temple. In other words, it is set in the past to talk about the present when it was written. In this highly stylized work, Ezra as a seer discusses theodicy with the angel Uriel before he is shown apocalyptic visions that secure his beliefs in God's imminent eschatological salvation, which is for the righteous of Israel who remain Torah observant, despite having no functioning temple. In the first of these apocalyptic visions, while Ezra is praying in a field far away from any humans, he sees a despondent woman mourning and weeping, with clothes torn and ash on her head. After some persistent questioning, Ezra is able to convince her to share her story. After 30 years of infertility, she was finally able to bear a child, a son, only to see him die on his wedding day. She mourned with her husband and with the support of the community, but when the official mourning period was over and her grief had not subsided, she fled in the night, came to the field where Ezra found her, and now she intends to mourn without food or drink until she dies. Ezra is put out that this woman is selfishly worried about her personal issues. How could she do that? While all of Israel is in exile, deported from Zion. He responds in anger, calling her most foolish of women, and tries to persuade her to let herself be comforted for her son's death, and instead direct her grief toward the destruction of Zion. He tells her to, quote, "Keep your sorrow to yourself and bear bravely the troubles that have come upon you. For if you acknowledge the decree of God to be just, you will receive your son back in due time. Therefore, go into the city to your husband." She responds, "I will not do so. I will not go into the city, but I will die here." Ezra tries again to convince her, and it is during his second speech to her that the mourning woman is transformed into a resplendent city. The angel Uriel interprets this transformation for Ezra. The mourning woman he was speaking to is Zion, or Jerusalem. The 30 years she was barren is equivalent to the 3,000 years that the world existed before the first offering was made in the Jerusalem temple. The woman finally having a son represents King Solomon's building of the first temple, and her bringing her son up is the period when the people lived in Jerusalem and could offer sacrifice in the temple. When the son dies at his wedding, it represents the temple's destruction. Uriel tells Ezra that the city into which the mourning woman transformed is the eschatological Zion, the heavenly Zion. Ezra is then invited to go into that God-given city to experience it as it will be at the end of days. The woman in this text is, of course, not meant to be read as a real woman, but instead as a personified Jerusalem, who does indeed mourn the destruction of her son, that is, the destruction of the temple, just as Ezra had chastised her for not doing before her transformation. Commentaries on 4th Ezra focus on the interpretive quality of the woman's story as it relates to Ezra's vision, but ignore that this figure is still, in fact, a woman. Let's again use a hermeneutic of imagination to explore the woman's refusal to listen to Ezra and her refusal to do what is expected of her to get over her mourning period as itself an act of resistance. The woman chooses to leave the potential comfort of her life with her husband and her community in order to honor the reality of her grief, bucking the traditional process of temporary mourning and reintegration. In her interactions with Ezra, she's adamant that she is not ready to do what he asks. The woman mourns in a way that is meaningful to her, and she will not be swayed. She remains firm in her convictions. On the one hand, the common trope found in antiquity of personifying cities as women can be seen as telling us nothing at all about any historical woman, and telling us more about the pervasively heteronormative male default that mediates the ancient world to us. On the other hand, we can learn a little something even from the way cities are depicted about what was expected of women and what was considered deviant. This bereaved Zion, who simply isn't finished grieving during the prescribed time limit, is touchingly relatable. Furthermore, her resistance to the figure of Ezra shows us that even the patriarchal author could conceive of an agenic woman who turned out to be no more than he did. She knew her mourning period was not yet over. She knew she should not return to her previous life. Had she listened to Ezra, he would not have experienced the eschatological Zion. When we flip the script and put ourselves into her shoes instead of the shoes of the male protagonist, there are stories to uncover. It's good timing. My current research explores the variety of Jewish and Christian leadership in the first several centuries CE. As I've been conducting this research, I keep coming across texts that may or may not fit with any idea of leadership, but they do address conceptions of resistance, especially in unexpected ways. Berenike is clearly identified as a leader, but her resistance spoke to me, as did the two women at Masada. They have been living in my mind for months as I wonder about the connection between them. While working on the updated NRSV study notes for Second Esdras, this is the book in the Apocrypha that contains Fourth Ezra, my research around the mourning woman Zion enraged me with how scholars dismissed her characters as only a vision and only as meaningful in relation to what she meant for Ezra. The way that 2 Maccabees 7 ends with a statement, last of all, the mother died after her sons, fills me with sadness. These texts elicit a visceral response. They sit with me and make me think about what it is we miss with our male-centered readings. I titled this talk, Resistance, Resilience, and Remembrance, to both get at what these narratives are doing when we take the time to explore them, but also what we as scholars are doing when we slow down and push back against dominant scholarly narratives as normative. Well, it has often been thought that there is very little evidence for ancient women, so their voices must be lamented as lost forever. I hope with this sampling of readings, I have highlighted that there is information to be found if we use lenses that center marginalized voices and that allow for a sometimes imaginative approach. So many other stories remain to be discovered. What of the two enslaved women, deacons of their church, who are tortured by Pliny the Younger for being Christians? Or the fantastical tale of Thecla, who hears Paul's preaching, wants to become a Christian, and when she is met with barrier after barrier as she tries to meet this goal, she just baptizes herself. What of Mary Magdalene, who is sexualized and slandered in the late antique record as a sex worker, penitent sinner, or lover, instead of a disciple, financial patron, or leader? When we uncover something of an ancient woman's lived experience, even if it is through the gendered eyes of male authors, it is not just a minor tidbit or trinket. Sarah Park talks about an impermeable conceptual wall between scholarship that uncovers women's history and so-called regular scholarship. On the one side of the wall are unspoken and widely accepted patriarchal assumptions around what constitutes appropriate method and subject matter. And on the other side is engaged scholarship, which can be dismissed as niche. Park writes that this largely unwritten rule conceptually limits investigations into ancient women, ancient female literary characters, and the construction of gender in the Second Temple period and early Christianity and Judaism as ancillary rather than of general relevance. Scholars feel they can safely ignore certain people in certain fields and not miss anything that will affect their ability to remain well-read and current, thereby colonizing and silencing women and minority scholars, secondary characters, and ancient women's voices. Annette Yoshiko Reed commented recently in the new podcast, Women Who Went Before, that we can have whole histories that barely mention women at all, never talk about the perspective of women, and that within modern scholarly culture, these histories are commonly presumed to be complete. Why do we presume that you can leave out so many people and still have a history that is a history of the Jews or a history of Christianity? Historical studies that include women or highlight gender in ways that haven't been done in the past provide new pathways into old questions, as well as creating new questions. They break open the data from new angles. They help us to develop a fuller picture so that we can answer our historical questions more accurately and more ethically. Parks argues that if we want to find more nuanced and robust answers to questions of history, we all need to engage in a paradigm shift where the study of women and the study of gender are not compartmentalized. This will by no means only enlighten scholarship where women are concerned, but it actually gives everyone a fuller picture of all of history that can elucidate questions far beyond the so-called niche of women and gender studies. Thank you.
At this point, I'd like to open the floor for any questions that you might have here from the audience for Dr. Sheinfeld. Perfect.
Hi, is it me, Aniba? Am I audible?
You
You're
are.
audible, not in the room. Can you hear Professor?
I will try and repeat the question.
But Dr. Sheinfeld, you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. I
Uh-oh.
for such a wonderful and powerful talk, and also it's lovely to meet you virtually, closer to meeting you in the flesh. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, weaving together sources that are not just illuminating and flipping the script, as you point out, in binary gendered terms, but also bringing together sources that are often studied separately in the fields of early Christianity versus Jewish studies. So I just really appreciate everything you did. My question pertains to wanting to collaborate and thinking together. How do we blend your insights together with increasingly trans-inflected understandings that question the trees with which we can even use the term real experience or real women, as opposed to trans historical understanding of men, and that also question male femininity in women and male masculinity and men. In other words, what happens? Admittedly, we are very behind if one wants to use this problematic evolutionary reckon. Admittedly, we have so much to do in flipping the script because of this assumed naturalness of not just men, but, and this is so invisible that we don't even say it, cisgender. The idea that cisgenderness is a trans-historical category that but what happens if we actually hold assumptions? In other words, what work can we do that doesn't reify binary sex gender and make it a trans-historical category? And I say this particularly because I'm so excited about your textbook, and I'm increasingly teaching students who question, what does it mean to say real men and real women? And I point this out because there's another textbook that you may well know about, edited by Boudin and Turfer, which is called Real Women in Antiquity, which is explicitly trans. It's a turfy book. That is, the authors in the introduction say, this is what we mean by women. It means chromosomes or secondary sex characteristics. And if you don't like it, put down this book. And I'm so clear that when you use the term gender and women, you're not doing this. But I do think that there is a conundrum about how we go about these projects of retrieval and flipping, and this problem of binarity. So this is not to undermine the project. It's really just to think kind of collaboratively how we can push it even further. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is an excellent question. Did you all get most of that? Okay, I was speaking to the people who are present in the room. So this is an excellent question. And the first answer is I don't know. And whenever I do my work, I struggle in every single sentence I write, where I write the word women. I'm like, do I have to say this? Is there a way not to say this? You know, how do I do this? So this is, I don't have an answer, but it is something that that I struggle with as well. And so I love the question, because I love that I'm not the only one thinking about it and trying to figure out how to move beyond these kind of binary categories that we end up starting out with because of our contemporary society, but also making sure that our scholarship is still accessible to people who say aren't heavily into queer theory and don't know some of the terminology or some of the language. And so, yeah, this is, yeah, I'm there with you. And I really struggle with this as well. So thank you. And I'm sorry, I don't have I wish I had a solution. Anybody have a solution? Nobody here has a solution either. So thank you, Rafe. Okay. So I can repeat it? Yeah. Does that work? Okay.
Hi, my name is Trevor Bechtel. I was very interested by the way in which you worked with mock stories. They're still metaphorical, and not on a literal reality. There's a lot of theory of animals. There's real value there, and one is it might not have some possibilities to actually in terms of thinking about the different metaphors that we're taking. I was looking for the kind of there are these images of people early
Sure.
on.
Yeah. So let's see if I can try and sum that up. So the kind of question comment was thinking about other, as with Fourth Ezra, thinking about other metaphorical imagery related to gender. Am I getting this right? And how we can kind of take that metaphor and also map it back onto kind of thinking about what that means in kind of reality, or in a more less metaphorical sense. So yeah, I mean, this is something that I mean, there are scholars who work on this. I mean, I'm much more familiar with like the stuff in Fourth Ezra, like Women as Cities. Davina Lopez has an amazing article that really breaks down thinking about, say, the Judea Capricorn, so which portray you know, the Judea as this defeated woman, right? It's a land that's been conquered by the Romans, and Rome is this, like, you know, this man standing over her. And in this article, she talks about how, like, this is a coin, it's imagery, it's used as money, but it also has kind of real sense of kind of a defeated woman, probably assaulted woman. I mean, the man standing there holding a scepter that comes out of his groin area. So there's very clear sexual imagery present. So this isn't directly answering your question, but there are yeah, amazing people doing work kind of thinking about how this imagery that seems like it's just metaphor is not just metaphor, that people read it or heard it or saw it and it meant something to them. And this is one of the things that really enraged me. I really felt enraged. You all can talk to my writing group, which will have them on the screen in a few minutes. But when I was working on the Fourth Ezra study notes and reading this bit about the mourning woman and the kind of scholarship that was written around her, there's no comment about how Ezra is. I mean, he's just mean, you foolish woman, stop your mourning, like, get over yourself. Who cares that your son died? Just like no empathetic response in the commentary at all. Now I know it's commentary, but there was nothing. There was no acknowledgement. It was just like, oh yeah, that just represents these other things. and it was just one of those things that this time, I've worked with this text for a long time, but this time I was just enraged at the fact that there was no recognition that this is a person who's being represented, not a real person, but represented as a woman, and she is so easily dismissed. Do you want to introduce them?
I'm just going to take a moment in the final 10 to 15 minutes. We are going to take a moment to introduce the other co-authors of this recent textbook. Hopefully I can be heard. So there's a recent textbook that not only Dr. Sheinfeld, but also Dr. Parks and Dr. Warren completed together. I will briefly introduce them and then open up in the last few minutes for a Q&A from the remote audience and from the in-person audience. So Dr. Parks, who's on the screen, is a professor, assistant professor in religious studies at St. Francis Xavier University.
Excuse me, Deb.
Yes.
Could you move the mic away from your mouth just a little?
Yeah, is that better?
That's a little better.
Okay. Is this better? Or is that
That is better. Yes, thank you very much.
okay? All right. Her area of expertise is also on women and gender. She wrote, along with the two of these other scholars, this textbook. Her other recent textbook is Gender in the Rhetoric of Jesus. Our other esteemed guest is Dr. Meredith Warren. Dr. Warren is the director of the Sheffield Center for Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies and a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield. Her research primarily focuses on early Jewish and Christian literature, variously looking at sensory and metaphor, gender and sexual violence, as well as anti-Judaism. Her first book was entitled My Flesh is Meat Indeed, a non-sacramental reading of John 6. Her most recent monograph is Food and Transformation in the Ancient Mediterranean. At this time, I'd open the questions to the audience. I will say that some of my students are present. We're using this co-written textbook in our course. It's been a fantastic pedagogical tool for me as an instructor. And I have reports from students that they are also enjoying it. So my students are welcome to ask questions. Anyone in the audience is welcome to ask questions, or of course, remote participants are welcome to ask questions as well.
We have a question from the floor. Yeah, I know. I'll try and summarize so that you can hear as well. The question was, and you can correct me if I need correcting, please. Is it kind of a question wondering about the relationship or the difference between women who are willing to sacrifice themselves, so it's kind of a self-sacrifice, versus self-preservation, which we saw both of during my talk. Whether there is. So whether there's a historical reason characters are acting in this way or some other kind of tension. So I mean, I'm happy to answer, but I've had to listen to myself. So I'm going to see if Meredith or Sara want to speak.
I mean, I can take a little stab, and I think you kind of hinted at this as well in your talk, Shayna. But I think women of different status and different socioeconomic location are going to choose different tactics depending on what their options are. So you alluded to these enslaved deacons in the letter of Pliny. They will not have had the choice to have the kind of resistance where they are necessarily surviving, and that is their form of resistance. Whereas Berenike has all of the options available to her, and except probably torture. Like probably no one is going to torture her because she's like the queen. So I think status has a lot to do with the kinds of options that are available to different women, and I think people are making choices based on not necessarily a whole array of those options, but a limited set of options, maybe only between one or two things.
Sarah, did you want to add anything?
Well, I guess I could add that one of the things, that's a question that makes me think about the all important chapter of our textbook, chapter 4, that tries to deal with hermeneutics, approaches, lenses, as we like to call them. And it has the choice of making historical criticism one tool in the toolbox among many, was deliberate. And the thing is that by itself, historical criticism looks subjective, claims to be objective. We do it and we think we're being objective, but if we don't put on these other hats that have to do with class, enslavement, monetary, textual production, who's paying for it, gender, are the women, as Liz was saying in the chat, are the women in Josephus witnesses for a reason, for a rhetorical reason? What does that tell us about gender in the mind of the author? That all of those questions, historical criticism is one thing, but by itself, it's actually not very objective because it is not taking the time to ask those other questions that bring to the fore all of the pressures and the power dynamics at play.
Deb has a question.
Um,
Dr. Fortune.
For maybe the benefit of the audience and others, could you maybe speak a little bit about the origins of the textbook, why you chose to write it together, maybe the niche of the field, and what was it that made you feel compelled to write this work at this time? As I mentioned already, I think it's been enormously helpful for me pedagogically, and I think it's a wonderful textbook, but I'm curious about your origin story and why you chose to write it.
I don't know if anybody saw, but Meredith was pointing at Sara, I'm pretty sure. So we know who's going to answer now.
I think the story started with me because we were all PhD candidates together and at McGill University. And part of our PhD there was meant to be teaching experience, but there was not enough of it to go around. And so there was kind of a lottery, like you propose a class, you get a chance to teach a class if you sort of win this lottery. And there might have been 50 graduate students at a time there, but there were 2 classes per year that were available. And I got one of them. I had proposed a class called Reading Women in Greco-Roman Judaism and Christianity. And I said reading because much of what we have to learn about women is text. So we were going to talk about hermeneutics and gender and women. And I felt very excited about this class, but also terrified because there was no textbook. There was just lots of primary literature and then lots of kind of textbook literature that did not focus on women and gender. And so what I did that started all of this was say to Meredith and Shayna, I want to split the class 3 ways with you. Let's do this together so we can all get teaching experience and so that we can benefit from, Meredith's more experience in classics, archaeology, anthropology, Shayna's experience in rabbinics and pseudepigrapha and this kind of stuff. And so we taught that class together, and it was extremely difficult to take the kinds of, we wanted to deal with coins, numismatics, we wanted to deal with mosaics and art depictions. We wanted to deal with rhetoric, We wanted to deal with gender studies and all these different methods. What is history? What is being a historian? And so, I mean, it was just a summer class, but it nearly killed us with the work. But it set all three of us on a path teaching a class like this for years. And at some point, we amassed a lot of resources, activities, discussion questions, excerpts, abstracted articles. And we kind of had a textbook like for ourselves. And then I guess I'll let Meredith say why this actually turned into a textbook.
Well, I mean, we were in the Atlanta SBL. Is that the one that we were at? Is it the Atlanta one? I feel like it was Atlanta. And I had a meeting with an editor from Routledge, and she asked, just having a chat about what kinds of things I was working on and what if I had anything for Routledge. And I just said, like, hey, we're working on this textbook and there isn't one out there. I don't know what possessed me. Something possessed me. I kind of thought, like Sara said, that we had the textbook like kind of basically written already. It turns out I was wrong and we didn't have it mostly written. But yeah, we had a contract like pretty much within the week. And then 5 years later, we've submitted the manuscript. So yeah, it took us a little while. There was a pandemic in the middle of it, and some other things, different jobs and moving around, and some real restructuring of our thinking about the work as well. What we had been teaching and what we had been working with, we developed as scholars and as thinkers, and we really had to sort of tear things apart and rip it out at the seams from time to time, and that took some hard thinking and some hard work as well. So it did take a little while longer than we thought.
So Deb asked if, and I'm not going to get this as well as she just said it, but that throughout the textbook there are excerpts from all sorts of scholars, women, non-binary scholars, and she wants to know if that was an intentional choice on our part, or if it was just okay. Oh, and right. So she also wants to know if this is an intentional way of us addressing the Bruton phenomenon that our esteemed colleague, Dr. Parks, named for a wonderful scholar whose research has been vastly ignored by mainstream scholarship. So yeah, that's the question. One of you two want to answer? Should I?
I mean, I can take a first stab of it, but we may all want to just take a turn. I mean, it was definitely deliberate. We were very conscious about who we included, and whose work we engaged with and whose work we wanted to amplify. I personally think some of the scholarship that was sort of very recently published when we wrote the book, I firmly believe is going to be the mainstream or the consensus in a number of years. And I don't think it served our purposes or served our imagined students to repeat old arguments or old versions of a consensus that, we don't teach that way. We teach the imaginative possibilities that happen when you look at things from a different perspective. And we know scholars who are doing that work right now. So there was no point in us playing it safe and just citing the same old people. We wanted to include the people who are pushing the boundaries and doing the kind of work that we want to see, frankly, all over the academy. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I would also add that one of the things I talked about in my talk today is that doing the kind of work that I'm doing in some ways is also an act of resistance on my part. I'm pushing back. We are pushing back against, in some ways, the way we've been trained, which doesn't mean that we don't appreciate how we've been trained, but PhDs generally train a certain way, most of who we read are white, Christian, European, at least originally men. Not everybody, and not always, and not in every field. But certainly in my experience, this is what we have predominantly. There is amazing work out there by people who are not those things. And so being really intentional, right? So like I said, in some ways, an act of resistance itself to say, I'm not going to center those voices. I know them coming in. I've been trained with them. I have them in my head. I can use them when and if I think it's necessary, but centering those other voices and being intentional about going out and finding them, because we also we're trained to look for those. And it can be a lot more work to have to go out and look for scholars who don't know yet, to find people you haven't heard, to think of questions that you've never it's never occurred to you to ask before. It's a lot of work, but it's always been, in my experience, really worthwhile.
I'd like to add to that, Shayna, that we have a stereotype that diversity is the right thing to do and it's ethical and it's nice, but that it doesn't necessarily make things better. It's just the right thing to do. That is a false stereotype, because when we do engage in the politics of citation, meaning we make rules for ourselves that we cannot publish an article that is all white, European, Christian, mostly men. When we make those rules, we don't sprinkle in random scholars. We discover excellent scholars, and the work is better. We throw away things that are not serving anyone or that are just one slice of the pie. So yes, doing that work intentionally, it takes more time, because we've all been trained a certain way, and it's easy to fall into, but doing that work makes better scholarship. And we're not throwing away. When we made this textbook, we wanted students to know the basics, but we also wanted them to see some cutting edge. So it's a balance of the tradition. We stand on the shoulders of those who went before. Our textbook teaches about, like, Martin Hengel, Judaism and Hellenism are not a dichotomy. We use Martin Hengel, but we also use, Catherine Shayna, for example. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming to this event. Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, both in person and remote, who came out to this event, and for all of our sponsors. We appreciate so much. Let's give a round of applause to our 3 co-authors, and especially to Dr. Sheinfeld. Thank you so much.